On February 5th, 1840, a Franciscan friar named Father Thomas disappeared from the Jewish quarter of Damascus, Syria, along with his Muslim servant Ibrahim Amra. Father Thomas was well known in Damascus. A former pharmacist, he ran a service that provided smallpox vaccinations free of charge. Informed of the disappearance, the newly appointed French consul, Count Ulysses de Ratimenton, observed, if his letter to the French Foreign Ministry is accurate, that the street was full of Christians from all the different sects who were shouting that Father Thomas had been slain by the Jews. The consul began an immediate investigation. Ratimenton and his dragoman, his interpreter and official guide in Ottoman territory, Jean-Baptiste Boudin, went to Father Thomas's small monastery, where he lived alone with his servant. Initial investigation of the incident failed to turn up any relevant evidence. At the monastery, 2 places were set for dinner, and dishes were out to begin cooking, indicating that both Father Thomas and his servant had expected to return. Further exploration of the monastery revealed a surprising amount of wealth for a simple friar. Fine clothes filled Father Thomas's closets and his servant's armoire. Expensive imported books filled the library, and the cupboards were well stocked with medical equipment and supplies. Most worrying of all, investigation unearthed nearly $6,000 in silver coins, the equivalent of over $200,000 today. Still, while the monks' flamboyant lifestyle was questionable, wealth was not a crime, and there was no evidence of violence or of the monastery being robbed. Nothing was obviously missing or disturbed, and the door was secure. The investigators were stumped. In 1840, Syria's political situation was complex. Although Syria was under Ottoman rule, Catholics were legally under the protection of the French government due to a series of deeply unequal treaties called the capitulations. Complicating matters even more, the Ottomans were engaged in combating a long-lasting Egyptian revolt, led by the former Ottoman general and governor, Muhammad Ali. And from 1839 to 1840, Ali's forces controlled Syria. Lacking evidence, facing widespread Christian protests, and being more than a little anti-Semitic himself, the consul did what any self-respecting colonial ambassador would do. He invented the evidence he wanted. He enlisted the help of the Governor-General, Muhammad Sharif Pasha el-Kabir, who just so happened to be Muhammad Ali's son-in-law. Sharif Pasha, eager to secure the assistance of the French against the Ottomans, was happy to help. The Pasha's first act was to summon Rabbi Antabi, the chief rabbi of Damascus, and demand his assistance in discovering Father Thomas. On his knees before the Pasha, the distraught rabbi asked and answered a hypothetical question. Is the Jewish quarter closed off? It is open on every side. Thousands of people go in and out, day and night. So how can the law hold us responsible? Lacking the authority or police force to examine every visitor to the quarter, the rabbi bitterly quoted Genesis, asking, "Am I my brother's keeper?" According to the rabbi, the Pasha's response was to strike him on the head and to accuse the Jews of ritual sacrifice. "It is obvious to me that you killed him to take his blood, and that that's your custom. Don't you know about the expulsion from Spain and other expulsions, and about the thousands of Jews killed because of this issue? And yet you stick to this custom of killing people secretly. I have sworn that now I too shall kill you without number, until not even 2 Jews are left here." With this accusation, Sharif Pasha was trotting out an old anti-Semitic trope, the blood libel. Blood libel, regularly invoked to persecute Jews in Europe during the Middle Ages, was a false claim that Jews needed human blood to include in Passover matzah. It is possible that Rabbi Antabi exaggerated his account in hindsight, but regardless of the Pasha's exact words at the time, the blood libel accusation came to feature prominently in this case. Lacking a body, or any obvious suspects, Sharif Pasha and Ratimenton secured the assistance of an imprisoned Muslim debtor, Muhammad al-Tali, offering to free him on the condition that he would work hard to put us on the tracks of the criminals within a few days. Al-Tali was a former poll tax collector, known for extorting both Jewish and Christian merchants, who claimed to know all the bad characters amongst the Jews. He was also a profligate spender, who had been imprisoned for debts on multiple occasions, and it was not the first time he had offered information to the authorities for a price. Sure enough, under pressure from the authorities, Al-Tali cast suspicion on a Jewish barber by the name of Solomon Hayek, as well as 3 other Damascus Jews. The evidence against Hayek was scant. A promotional flyer that Father Thomas had placed at the Jewish synagogue was found above the barber's door. Nevertheless, it was also the only evidence the authorities had. So Hayek was arrested and subjected to extensive torture and interrogation. Seeking to end the torture, Hayek implicated a number of leading Jews, including 2 rabbis, as well as members of the Farhi and Harari families, 2 of the most prominent Jewish families in Damascus. The Farhi family was especially prominent. As recently as 1820, the family head had been the financial vizier to the provincial governor, and in 1799 he had been directly involved in stopping Napoleon's siege on the city of Acre. Nevertheless, the family's fortunes had waned in recent years. Though Muhammad Ali loosened many restrictions on Jewish religious and social life, he also pursued a policy of placing Greek Catholic merchants, the Jews' principal commercial rivals, in important administrative positions. The Farhi's political standing was not what it once was, but their prominence within the community made them easy and politically convenient targets. Over the following months, the situation continued to escalate. The individuals implicated by Hayek were arrested and subjected to repeated torture and leading questioning, where they were encouraged to provide evidence of a conspiracy of blood libel among the Jewish leadership. Making matters worse, the Jewish leaders of Damascus were tortured into making false confessions, admitting to the ritual sacrifice of Father Thomas in order to prepare for Passover. Due to YouTube's content restrictions, I won't include a description of the torture here, but details of the horrific acts were recorded by George Wilden Pearce, a converted Protestant missionary and former rabbi who traveled from the Protestant mission in Jerusalem to Damascus in order to report on the incident. A link to Pearce's accounts is in the description below. In addition to the torture, the authorities continued to manufacture evidence. Bones and a scrap of cloth were discovered in a local sewer. A doctor was paid to declare them to be human bones, and the scrap was declared to be part of Father Thomas's vestments. Evidence that contradicted the blood libel story was also difficult to come by, and what was discovered was conveniently ignored. A tobacco seller named Isaac Yavo had seen Father Thomas and his servant leaving the city before sunset on the evening they were supposedly killed, and was persuaded, after receiving reassurances to his safety, to testify to the Pasha and the French consul. His testimony was ignored. Similarly, it was discovered that Father Thomas and his servant had a violent altercation with a team of Muslim mule drivers and an indebted Muslim merchant, who was later discovered to have committed suicide. The Jewish community thought the incident might be related to the murder and asked for its investigation, but the Pasha refused. In short, the situation was dire. Left to their own devices, it appeared that the French consul, with the cooperation of the Egyptian authorities, would prefer to manufacture a conspiracy and punish the entire Jewish community rather than to honestly investigate the case. Jews had been here before. Whenever blood libel accusations were spread, they had historically been driven from their homes, had their possessions seized, and been sent into permanent exile. Despite the Damascus community's best efforts at investigating Father Thomas's disappearance, the situation quickly deteriorated. The torture of Jewish suspects continued, and copycat accusations began to flare up elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, unlike the Jews confronted with blood libel in the Middle Ages, the Jewish community of the 19th century had three new tools to fight back against persecution. First, in much of Western Europe, including France and England, they had almost full political rights. Second, some European Jews had achieved substantial political influence, most notably the Rothschild banking family, whose Austrian members had been elevated to the nobility in 1822 and were on good terms with Austria's foreign minister, Prince Clemens von Metternich. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they had access to the mass media and the opinion pages of the newspapers. The Damascus Affair galvanized these resources, becoming the first real test of Jews' newfound ability to collectively advocate for their own welfare. The reaction in France provides a particularly clear illustration of the coordinated Jewish response. The French press initially reported the blood libel accusations uncritically, as fact, first in the Semaphore de Marseille. At first, the Jewish response was relatively atomistic, isolated to some rabbis writing back refuting the charge, most notably the chief rabbi of Marseille, M.D. Cohen, and the chief rabbi of Smyrna, Pinhas de Segura. Each emphasized both the torture of the accused and the kosher prohibition on using any animal blood, let alone human blood, in Jewish religious life. However, when the accusations continued to be reported in other papers, the coordination of the Jewish response rapidly escalated. On the request of E. Kilby, an English businessman residing in Beirut, an Amsterdam merchant, Hirsch Leren, wrote to the French Baron James de Rothschild asking for his intervention in the affair. The Baron was in London attending a family wedding, but on his return to France, he enlisted the help of Albert Cohn, his children's tutor, and Adolphe Cremieux, a famous defense lawyer and vice president of the Central Consistory, the French agency in charge of Jewish affairs. Cremieux immediately began a media campaign, publishing an extensive refutation of the charges on April 8th in not one, but two major Paris newspapers. Cremieux excoriated the French press for their irresponsibility, tying the sensationalism of the reporting of the accusations to the political motives of right-wing Christian nationalists. Is it really true that in France, in Paris, those newspapers which are the most devoted to the ideas of progress and liberalism, no less than those whose political and religious ideas lag farthest behind our times, have accepted the absurd and monstrous stories emanating from Alexandria and Beirut about the murder of Father Thomas and his servant? And that they have done so without any challenge and in deplorable haste? Is it possible? Can it be that in 1840, this despicable calumny born of the infamous prejudices of medieval Christianity is not rejected in disgust, but is being repeated? Cremieux's approach succeeded in shifting the media narrative from an unquestioning acceptance of anti-Semitic rumor to a political debate between reformers and Christian nationalists. It also bought time for Jewish notables and organizations to begin a lobbying campaign across Western Europe. The first and arguably most important lobbyist was the Austrian Baron Solomon Mayer von Rothschild, who used his personal connections with the Austrian Chancellor, Clemens von Metternich, to advocate for Austrian intervention on behalf of the falsely accused Damascus Jews. Metternich was a conservative monarchist, but also a rationalist product of the Enlightenment, who viewed religious toleration as essential to maintaining order in a complex society. Solomon Rothschild succeeded in convincing Metternich that the charges leveled against Solomon Hayek, Rabbi Antabi, and the Farhi Harari families were ludicrous and barbaric, and that intervening on the Jews' behalf could help promote Metternich's goal of making Austria diplomatically central to resolving the Egyptian-Ottoman War. Metternich settled on threatening Muhammad Ali's civilized reputation in Europe, a reputation that Ali had carefully cultivated to prevent European powers from intervening against him on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan. In a dispatch to Anton von Loren, the Austrian consul in Alexandria, Metternich conveyed his expectations for how the Damascus Affair should be resolved. The Egyptian authorities are duty-bound to ensure strict and swift justice. The misuse of power, persecutions, and the mistreatment of innocent people would, however, become known throughout all of Europe and would undoubtedly be an open contradiction to the viceroy's views. At the same time, Metternich sought to play the Turkish and Egyptian authorities against each other, making them compete for Austrian favor by comparing their treatment of the blood libel case. On the same day he sent the dispatch to Loren, Metternich sent a similar dispatch to Bartholomeus von Sturmer, Austria's ambassador in Constantinople, with respect to copycat blood libel accusations that had sprung up in Rhodes. The Chancellor conveyed that the persecution of entire families and communities was unacceptable, and urged Sturmer to tip the wink to the Turkish regime, so that they instruct the Pasha of Rhodes accordingly, and that you let our civic council in Rhodes know that in such cases he should work in the spirit of sensible mediation. Despite the dispatches to Loren and Sturmer, the situation continued to escalate, with some of the accused being threatened with execution. As a result, toward the end of April and the beginning of May, the direct lobbying campaign expanded into England and France, and renewed efforts were made to win public opinion onto the side of the accused Jews. On April 21st, the Board of Deputies of British Jews called a special meeting to discuss the ritual murder case. Despite its name, the board was not an official political body, but instead a voluntary association of 5 leading London synagogues. To date, its only political involvement had been to quietly campaign for the extension of political representation rights to British Jews. The scope of this meeting was without precedent. Nevertheless, not only were the members of the board present, so too were a number of politically involved members of the Jewish elite, including members of the Whig political establishment, Lyon and Francis Goldsmid and David Solomons, as well as the English baron, Lionel de Rothschild. Adolphe Cremieux also made a special trip from Paris to attend the meeting. Cremieux's attendance was especially important, as he had spearheaded the French media campaign and also served as a liaison for the French branch of the Rothschild family. He also came bearing a promise that the French Central Consistory would cooperate with the meeting in seeking to stay the cruel persecution directed against our Eastern brethren. Lionel de Rothschild's attendance was equally vital, since with his support it became obvious that all 3 major branches of the Rothschild family were prioritizing the support of the Damascus Jewish community. Solomon was lobbying Metternich in Austria, James was supporting Cremieux's media campaign, and Lionel was now involved through the Board of Deputies in London. Between the support of the various political notables and Cremieux's guarantee, the Board of Deputies elected to take a strong stance. First, it began a media campaign of its own, adopting resolutions denouncing the abominable calumnies perpetrated by the authorities in Damascus and Rhodes, and calling the ritual murder claim a medieval conspiracy that had long disappeared from this part of the world, with the fierce and furious prejudices that gave it birth. Second, the board appointed a delegation to request an interview with the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, and published its demand for the interview in no less than 31 British journals. In keeping with his promise, Cremieux called a meeting of the French Central Consistory immediately upon returning to Paris. Since the consistory was an administrative body of the French government, they could not take official action in the media. The consistory did have the ability to mount an internal lobbying campaign, and elected to copy the Board of Deputies by pursuing a meeting with Adolphe Thiers, the French head of government. For the first time, the Jewish people now had a coordinated advocacy campaign spanning across Western and Central Europe. Grounded in empathy for their compatriots in the Ottoman Empire, and a deep concern that the anti-Semitic accusations could spread if left unchecked, their efforts were generally well received by the respective governments. Adolf Thier, writing in the Moniteur Universel, put it best. When the facts were known, the Jews were aroused all over Europe, and they brought to this affair an enthusiasm and heat which in my eyes do them profound honor. And, if I may be permitted to say so, they are more powerful in the world than they have pretensions to be. At this very moment, they are putting forward their claims in every foreign chancellery, and they are doing so with an extraordinary vigor and with an ardor which can hardly be imagined. The extended campaign succeeded, but only after much negotiation, posturing, and the exchange of political favors. It also, predictably, became entangled with the politics of Muhammad Ali's ongoing rebellion against the Ottoman Sultanate. Although the European powers, particularly Palmerston and Metternich, viewed the Jewish issue as essentially independent from their own concerns with regional stability, they were more than happy to use the optics around the issue to compel compliance from the warring parties. By 1840, the conflict between Egypt and the Ottoman Sultan had become a proxy conflict for the European powers. France supported Egypt to continue their expansion into North Africa and reduce the threat to their own Algerian holdings. Britain and Austria, by contrast, supported the Ottomans and wanted to arrest French expansion. Yet, in a rare moment of unity, all three powers opposed the baseless arrest of the accused Damascus Jews. As a result, the coordinated lobbying campaign used the promise of French military support as a lever to pressure Muhammad Ali, while the British and Austrians put pressure on the Ottoman Sultan. The situation came to a head in July, when the Convention of London proposed a compromise and an ultimatum. Britain and Austria offered Ali permanent control over Egypt, Sudan, and, if he accepted quickly, the city of Acre, in exchange for limitations on the size of his military, and his withdrawal from Arabia and the Levant. Loath to give up his territories, and counting on the support of France, Ali hesitated, and the deadline for the agreement passed. By early September, Britain and Austria established a naval blockade on the Nile Delta. The French support failed to materialize. Trying to forestall military intervention against Ali, and desperate for French support, on September 6, 1840, Sharif Pasha released the incarcerated Jews, though many would bear the scars of their torture for the rest of their lives. In response, Britain and Austria stepped up the pressure on the Sultan. On September 16th, the Ottoman Sultan issued a decree declaring that a careful examination of Jewish beliefs demonstrated that the charges were pure calumny and extended to Jews the same privileges as are granted to the numerous other nations who submit to our authority. Unfortunately for Ali, the Jewish issue was always viewed as separate by the European powers, regardless of their diplomatic protestations. Ultimately, France was simply unwilling to go to war with England and Austria over Egypt. In October, the French finally switched sides, and threw their support behind the London Convention. By November, the Sultanate regained control of Syria, and Sharif Pasha was forced to return to Egypt, where he would be rewarded for his incompetence with the post of finance minister. Ali's family was given hereditary control over Egypt and Sudan, but nominally remained a viceroy of the Ottoman Sultan. With the Jewish community, the impact of the Damascus Affair was to demonstrate the effectiveness of collective action, but also to cause a split within the community over what direction Jewish self-advocacy should take. Some, such as the French Alliance Israelite Universelle, advocated education, economic self-empowerment, and cultural assimilation. Others argued that those changes would take decades or more to succeed, if they ever did. The latter camp came to be split between various flavors of communist revolutionaries and Zionists arguing for emigration. Perhaps the single most emblematic figure of this camp was the communist-turned-Zionist Moses Hess, who claimed the Damascus Affair began his awakening to the need for a Jewish homeland. 20 years ago, when news came to Europe from Damascus of an absurd accusation against the Jews, a feeling of agony, as bitter as it was justified, was evoked in the hearts of all Jews. Once again, we were face to face with the ignorance and credulity of the mobs of Asia and Europe, which are as ready today as they have ever been for the past 2,000 years to believe any calumny directed against the Jews. I was painfully reminded, for the first time in many years, that I belong to an unfortunate, maligned, despised, and dispersed people, but one that the world has not succeeded in destroying.